Give it up!
And I think that, this is an eminently rewatchable movie. And you discover more and more with every viewing. I wanted to ask you, start from the origins and ask Ryan. Most people know that there's some content autobiographical in the comic and this and that. Can you tell us what's the origin for you and where the comic took you from the moment you conceived it to the moment you finished it? How did it change?
Oh my God.
I'm bored too, and why are you dressed?
I grew up in Canada, southern Ontario, and
that explains everything. Next question.
That's it. Yeah, I mean, I moved to Toronto when I was in my early 20s because that's kind of what everyone does there. It's just the city, and that was just kind of my experience. I was in a band, and I had a gay roommate, and I started dating this American girl, and that's just, I wanted to just kind of capture whatever that world, my milieu.
What is beautiful about the movie is there is for me, and this is perhaps the most autobiographical. You didn't fight anything.
I didn't fight it.
All right.
No. But what inspired it originally was that my girlfriend told me that I somehow found out that she had dated 3 guys named Matt. And I just thought 3 Matts was kind of a funny concept. And what if they were evil? Anyway,
Evil Matt.
I don't know. To be honest, I was smoking a lot of pot.
Ultimately, did you ever meet the 3 guys?
No.
So did they weigh heavily on your mind?
Oh, not at all, no.
And you're a good man. But because one of the things that I find in the film curious is, or intriguing is the fact that there is a way of reading it where it could all be happening in Scott's mind. Is that something that was true for the comic too, for you?
Yes, I think. Yeah. I always wanted to kind of walk this line between fantasy and reality, and the parts, especially in the first book, when they burst into the battle and the song and stuff, it's his friends start kind of acting differently. It becomes his version of everyone, and it's all just this sort of fantasy construction, and yeah, I think it could go either way.
I think it's an easier, one of the challenges of making the film was to make that kind of level of reality work, because I think that's a little bit easier to, not that it's easy, but like easier to pull off in a comic book form, because you accept certain things that you don't accept with the film. And what I was saying to Guillermo earlier, one of the trickiest scenes was like, which doesn't affect the books quite as much, but definitely affects the film, is like the scene after Matthew Patel first explodes into coins, is you have to kind of really be very kind of like strict and very detailed about how the rest of the world reacts. And the one line that you never hear is somebody saying, what the fuck was up with that fighting? Like, nobody ever calls into question Scott's kind of action prowess. And so that was definitely something that like, that some people kind of find harder to accept, or it's not really playing within like a level of reality that you see in many Western films. But that was also what completely intrigued me to adapt in the book, is that I thought that like, that what had become from like the 3 Matthews that turned into 7 Evil X's is like an amazing visual metaphor for how you sometimes feel about an X's baggage, and you tend to demonize them, and that it kind of exploded into this, kind of Kung Fu vengeance kind of saga was just so irresistible. But it's difficult stuff to kind of pull off in like a Western movie, especially in a studio movie, that like the perceived lack of rules is something that kind of,
Yeah, we'll speak about that in a second. You want to say something?
I was just going to say that, yeah, it was easier in comics, because comics are usually about people fighting. Up to that point, I had always just done these, quirky indie movie type stories where it's just people talking, driving around, having their existence. And I was like, I'm going to do something with a fight. That's this indie movie sensibility of just fighting, because that's what comics should be about. And there's superhero comics, there's Japanese comics, and there's lots of fighting. So that's where the fighting came from.
But what is curious is that one of those tonal shifts and the reality alteration that can occur effortlessly and instantly also is quite influenced by manga. And the fact that in manga and anime, you can have a character talking very earnestly about himself in mythical terms and then scream and yell and the eyes widen, and all those shifts are really second nature to a graphic medium, but they are really hard to pull off on film. I think that one of the things that I feel is key is the choice of Michael, and by that I mean Michael Thompson, my friend. Michael. Michael Thompson, the gaffer. So, can you speak a little bit about your process getting to Michael? And Michael, when he called you, did he identify himself?
Well, I think there is that element where, in bringing the tone of the books across, there are things, especially that you can do in manga, that don't always come across well in live action. And I think for Michael, and when we talked about it, it was half kind of like, bringing Michael out of his comfort zone into kind of massive kung fu battles that he'd never done before. But
I have no comfort zone, by the way.
Michael has no. I didn't know.
He was born without one.
Very comfortable in my life.
But I think it's half the idea of seeing you kind of in pitch battle like that, and then also like a way of kind of grounding the character. I mean, one of the things that, to go back to the previous question, but one of the things that Bryan said about Scott Pilgrim, which to me kind of said everything about the film, was that Bryan's kind of note about Scott Pilgrim as a character is Scott is the hero of the movie inside his own head. And especially when you look at books like that, and in the last volume, Bryan does like a moment where a flashback is revealed to maybe be completely different because Scott is an unreliable narrator. But once I had that kind of information, it was a really great way of like how to imagine the movie, is that this movie is playing inside Scott Pilgrim's head, and the real version of it would be like a 16mm Sundance indie comedy with no fighting. But Scott Pilgrim has kind of reinterpreted it as this thing with massive kind of kung fu battles and musical sequences, and the reality of it would be kind of like a quirky indie comedy minus the fight sequences.
Yeah, he's played too many video games.
Yeah.
And smoke pot.
And smoking pot. The pot is not mentioned in the book. It's the secret element.
He was Stoner film for the big day. How did you
Like
meet
that.
Michael, and when was your
We were both obsessed with Arrested Development when we first started talking to each other. And Michael Cera was like, hello, nice. How many years ago was that?
Well, I think when we first, I've been working on this, I first read it in 2004 and first spoke to Bryan in
It's been 6 years
2004.
since we first spoke.
Yeah, and at that time I think sort of you were, how old were you? Like 16? Yeah.
It is a tricky question.
It's about 16.
So we waited until Michael was of legal drinking age to start making the film. But it was that thing that when we first talked about it, and this is before Hot Fuzz was when I first started working on it.
You started showing me storyboards about it about 5 years ago.
Yeah. It's been a long time in the process. The first draft of the script existed before Hot Fuzz. And I think the first time I met Michael was on the Hot Fuzz press tour. But, there was a point I remember thinking that Michael would be perfect, and that he was too young. And then it kind of came around to by the time of release, you were exactly the age of the character.
Now, there are a few movies, I think that, or works that I think evoke so clearly what it is to be young. It really is a blessing when you find a piece like this that really reminds you the complex simplicity of being young. Your problems are few, but they run very deep. And I think the movie evokes that perfectly. And I would like to point, there are two guys, and you may tell me I'm full of shit, which actually I am. Not in the physical sense. There are two guys that come to mind. One of them is Richard Lester, and the other one is Mike Hodges. So if you can talk about them, if they are indeed an influence in the way you approach the movie at all.
Well, it's funny, I kind of grew up, I think Richard Lester is one of those directors that I'm ashamed to say I grew up on and then kind of maybe even forgot that was an influence to me. But then when a number of people mentioned it to me about Richard Lester and I kind of realized that I'd grown up on his stuff, whether it was like, if you know the running, jumping, standing still film. I think that's one of the first things I ever saw on TV. And even, his Three Musketeers and, Help and Hard Day's Night. And so I think sort of like retroactively I've realized that he's been a big influence on me.